Welcome to SAM Conversation, an online program of South Asia Monitor. Today is a very live topic, Ukraine and the challenges for India. We have, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jayadev Ranade, former Additional Secretary, Government of India, and President of the Center for Chinese Strategy and Analysis. Lieutenant General P.G. Kamath, very highly decorated soldier of the Madras Regiment, who has seen enough service on both the line of actual control and the line of control, and a very he writes very profusely. And Major General Jagatbir Singh, who retired as the Director General Resettlement. He's from the Armoured Corps, 18th Cavalry, second generation soldier, and also a prolific writer. I'm afraid whatever I have to say in this short narrative of mine is generally going to be full of lament. My first lament is at the US and the NATO nations who are bent on keeping the Cold War going. And of course, along with it, keeping their arms industries thriving. And the second lament is against Mr. Putin, who also has been carrying on with the Cold War, and now making it very hot, very hot. And at Ukraine, which allowed itself to get militarized, and I think everyone, at least between Russia and Ukraine, both miscalculated. And I won't say any more, but I'm sure there is enough. Our discussions will elaborate on these aspects. And it's a great pity about 20,000 odd Indian students who are trying very hard to find their way, to get picked up, to find a safe place and get picked up by Indian aircraft. And with all that's happening, we also need to keep one eye open on China. Mr. Ranade, I request you to get the ball rolling.
Thank you, Anil, and a good afternoon to all the other co-panelists. It's a very, not only a hot topic, but it's a topic, I think, which has repercussions for a number of countries around the world. For us, certainly. I think with one stroke, what Putin has done is he has challenged the existing world order. He has challenged the United States, and he has, shall I say, smashed a myth that we have now reached a kind of equilibrium where countries will not attack or invade the other. That's what he's done. He's raised the threshold even more by saying that he will deploy his nukes, by having raised that threshold, the threat level. Though my understanding of how the Russian army operates is that they do treat their strategic, shall I say, weaponry as part of the conventional force deployment, unlike in the West and our countries where we keep them segregated. But that having been said, I think what we are seeing are 2-3 things which I'd like to point out. The first is that Putin obviously has planned it for a while. He has thought over this. He has also warned and threatened Ukraine and the other countries who, for some strange reason, chose to ignore the threats and, in fact, tell their own people and the others that nothing's going to happen, there's no threat of war, and accuse the Americans of creating a hype. The Americans, on the other hand, seem to have reacquired very good sources, very close to Putin, and they were coming out with intelligence in the public domain, laying it out there for everyone. But it is the same problem. I think the Europeans wanted to go their own way. The Ukrainians were like an ostrich, and American warnings were not paid heed to till Putin took the ultimate step. But as I was saying, the 2-3 points that I want to particularly mention is Putin's visit to Beijing. I think it was the third country that he visited after COVID set in person. And that meeting on the 4th of February, that summit meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping, I think was quite important. Just going by the joint statement that was issued, it was very clear that these two, I won't use the term characters, I think that's not very parliamentary, but these two gentlemen, both apparatchiks nurtured in their respective communist parties, and therefore sharing an ideological affinity and probably much more. But both of them had lengthy discussions, and my assessment is that Putin gave Xi Jinping a fair insight into what he was planning, if not gave him a full briefing, which Xi Jinping decided to keep for himself. The second point is that in the joint statement, both have spoken about democratization of the world order. In other words, translate that. It means that they are against the hegemony, so-called, which the US and the West exercises on the world order, and were looking to upturn it. That is one of the things, as you recall, I just mentioned, which Putin has tried to do. The third is both in the joint statement spoke about color revolutions. Now that is a fear, it's a paranoia that particularly communists have, and especially the Chinese, because they suspect that like the Jasmine Revolution, etc., and the Yellow Revolution, the Americans are going to try it in China. And they're looking at Xinjiang and Tibet as the two prime targets that will be attacked. Putin was looking at Ukraine in a similar light. So that has been mentioned in their joint statement. So that is the other part. Now, to substantiate the assessment that Putin shared with Xi Jinping in fair detail, if not in full, his plans, was the fact that immediately after that, he withdrew his troops from the borders with China and redeployed them for operations in Ukraine. Now, mind you, the Russians have kept those troops deployed because the Chinese, in their own devious manner, I think we are all used to that, but in their own devious way, had again started depicting the Donetsky island on the river as part of Chinese territory, despite the negotiations with the Russians showing that 50% is theirs and 50% is Chinese. Like the same way they're claiming Vladivostok. So that tension remains, but he withdrew the troops. The other aspect is that Xi Jinping had a meeting, convened a meeting of his Politburo soon after Putin left. Now, it is after that meeting, if you try and put a timeline, that there was some attempt at modulating the Chinese support for Russia. It is still there, it is still up front, the support, but the kind of language that initially came out has been toned down. Though, of course, they're still saying that, Russia was threatened. It was the NATO, etc., who pushed Russia into taking this action. So that is the scenario. I think as far as the Chinese are concerned, don't forget I said that Putin and Xi Jinping are made in the same mold. Xi Jinping is eyeing the United States response very, very closely. He's scrutinizing it, how the US and the West will respond to this situation, whether China will come into the line of fire or not, and that we can discuss a bit later in the program. But if he senses a weakness on the part of the Americans, I think we will see an emboldened Xi Jinping trying to grab what he sees is his opportunity. For us, I think we have taken the right steps already by increasing the level of vigil. The new air chief has recently said that he's placed his forces on high alert. I think that's the right step. We shouldn't be caught napping again, because I am certain that the Chinese have left their agenda unfinished thanks to our rapid counter buildup, but they will carry that out, and it may be sooner than we think. And the second target that he has in mind is Taiwan. So there again, he may not launch a direct assault on the main island, but he can certainly capture some of the outlying islands and thereby project himself as the man who had started the only leader, in fact, who had started the reunification of China, and thereby secure a term for himself at the upcoming party congress later this year, where he hopes for a third unprecedented term. I'll stop there, Anil, and we can pick up some of the other.
Thank you, Jayadev. Thank you for the various points brought out. And on China's possibility of waking up, well, all I'll say is that if there's an unfinished agenda of 2020, I'd like to see the Indian Army completed with arms this time, not bulletless, not without arms, and not with iron rods. Kamath, your take, please.
Firstly, from entire thing, what India has learned is one thing, which India knows already, that our wars have to be fought by our own armed forces. No one is coming to our aid. Let us be very sure of that.
Yes,
and that is the first thing which you have to learn. Second, battlefield transparency was so much that entire Russians who had outlined, who had armed kept their forces 90,000 to 150,000 all along, was very clearly known. The only misinterpretation of this battle information was the fault of Ukraine. Similarly, if you take a parallel, even in the Ladakh encounter, which took place in 2020, the entire Chinese had come down for their routine exercises in Tibet. We were aware of it, but again, we misinterpreted his intention, thinking that he will go back to barracks as usual. But he came and occupied the no man's land and occupied the 1959 LAC. So our second lesson is battlefield transparency, when you concentrate your troops on the LAC or border, is very well known. But how you interpret this information, that is second most important. Third, what is everyone knows it, but I will tell, the strategic autonomy which a country needs is very, very essential. And India has no time to lose, but increase our comprehensive national power. Because at critical times, where countries will keep on sanctioning us, there will be a portion of countries may sanction us, a portion of the countries may not sanction us. But to live up, it is one of the sanctioning is one of the factors of war before you start the war. That so and so countries will sanction us, and how do we overcome these sanctions during the conduct of the battle, the conduct of war, is fourth essential thing which we have to learn. Then next, we have to say is the challenge which India has now of around 20,000, now I believe it is 15, 16,000 students who are studying in Ukraine, with the Ukraine forces not at all being cooperative. They are trying to use them as human shields. That's what I learned. They are not even allowed to go across to the other neighboring NATO countries. And some of the NATO countries are also not cooperating with us. And hence, India has got a very, very tough schedule in front of them. How to really evacuate our students. These all should come into our factor whenever we conduct, whenever we plan a war, or when someone plans a war against us. Next, a most important thing which we have to learn from war. Just prior to the war, Russia ensured that her foreign currency reserve were $643 billion. You see the amount of currency, amount of money power, purchasing power it had prior to war. It didn't jump into the war without an exit strategy. I'm sure it has an exit strategy. Next economic thing, what you have to learn is national debt to the percentage of GDP. Russia is the seventh lowest. Seventh lowest means it has got only around 13 to 14% as the national debt as a percentage of GDP prior to the launch of war. If I have to tell that India has around 69% of a national debt percentage of GDP, United States has got 106% national debt as a percentage of GDP. Germany has around 50 and Japan has around 234% of GDP as the national debt. See how economically Russia has prepared itself prior to the launch of this offensive economically and how to overcome sanctions. All this has been done. Next, when you put a sanction against any country, it is always a double-edged weapon. Just see, because of the sanctions, the price of a barrel of fuel, crude oil, has gone up to $105 per barrel. And who has got the third highest oil production in this world? That is Russia. You see how Russia has got enriched because the entire value of the oil has come up. Next, SWIFT transaction for financial transaction from which Russia has been banned. It is actually, de-dollarizing the economy. They won't wait for dollars or the SWIFT currency. What they will exactly do is to trade with the China in renminbis, probably trade with India in rupees, trade with Germany for the gas in marks. So you find that the dollar is not being used in the international currency, international market, which will hit United States of America very, very badly. Next, if you see, as Jayadev had really had told about it, China is preparing. China is buying up oil at a very excessive market rates. Why it is buying? If it has to go on an offensive in Taiwan, against Taiwan, or against India, as a matter of fact, it has to keep its oil reserves ready so that it doesn't get interrupted, because that is one thing shortage in China, which it can't overcome without the support and without the logistics coming from other countries. So see, China is buying up oil at a higher rate. Though Biden had told the world, please release your oil reserves so that the price of the oil doesn't go beyond. He is just thumbing his finger at Biden and buying up oil. Why is China buying oil? What is our battle indicator for this? And I got a lot, the entire geopolitics of the world is going to change. The very blocks have to be changed. It is very, 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 if I say, imprudent on the United States of America. When Russia disintegrated, Soviet Union disintegrated, and Russia was formed. What happened when Russia was formed? There was no raison d'etre for the existence of NATO was not there. There were only 13 or 14 NATO powers in around early 90s. That has increased to 30 now. Means they have incorporated the entire Eastern European countries, 14 more into the NATO from the 90s till 2020. When you have expanded NATO, do you know the reason why? It was not geopolitics. It is geoeconomics, because whenever a country adopts a NATO charter, the entire weaponry, the equipment, the communication equipment, their design of battle, their conduct of battle has to be tailor-made to NATO. When they have to tailor-made to NATO, where do they buy their weapons and equipment from? From the military-industrial complex of United States of America. So US is gaining in terms of the arms export with every country coming into the NATO fold. I think I'll stop here. In the next session, I'll just tell you in a furthermore.
Thank you, General Kamath, for some very relevant points brought out by you. General Jagatbir, please throw light on your armed command on the kind of fighting that that was expected to be. It started first by saying that Russia would be aiming only for military targets, but I think there's enough mayhem created they've created enough damage to civil property and civil population also. Please.
At the outset, sir, I thank you for inviting me to be part of your panel and to share the stage with such eminent panelists as Mr. Ranade and General Kamath. General Kamath, I've had the experience and pleasure of listening to him on numerous occasions, particularly when he was in service and he spoke at Staff College. He used to come when he was Commandant Army War College. So, and we've all read a lot of what he's written. So, I mean, it's really a privilege.
He's known for shooting from the shoulder and not pulling his punches.
And sir, now, actually what we are seeing, what, both the previous speakers alluded to, actually we are heading back to old historical patterns, so to say. And as Yuval Harari, he said that one of humanity's greatest achievements was, the decline of war. But now this mere statement is in jeopardy. If you read one of his earlier books, Homo Deus, he talks of three things. He talks of, humanity affected by war, and by plague and by hunger. And he said, we've overcome all three of them. But what we've seen lately is the world was faced with COVID. You can be, and then we've had war now, and, hunger is again a question of whether we've actually overcome it or whether it's inequality. So, I mean, these are the things which are changing. And as the earlier speakers very rightly brought out, as General Kamath had said, at when the initial entente took place between that time President Gorbachev and President Bush, not Reagan of US, one of the first statements that they made was, there'll be no eastward expansion of the NATO. And as you rightly stated, sir, there's NATO and there's EU and there's democratic rights. Now, these are the three things which the West constantly harps on. One is a security alliance, one is an economic alliance, and one is a way of functioning. That means they want to turn people to democracy. And the thing that Mr. Ranade also brought out, the autocratic rulers fear that when the West says that we want them to be Democrats, they are anti the rulers of that place. So they feel anybody who's a Democrat will be pro-West. So, I mean, this is the story which is going. There are multiple narratives that are carrying out, sir, but as you've said, in war, the first victim is always truth. Nobody knows what is actually happening because you hear multiple narratives. There are things on the social media, there are things everywhere. What is more important is targeting population, or the words you pull out, or the images you're getting out, and how you're able to convince the other people. As Aristotle said in a very famous book of his, Rhetoric, he says you have to aim with words, you have to aim with the frame of mind of people, and finally you aim at the emotion, ethos. So, I mean, what are we aiming at? So you've talked about one issue, which is the battles which are unfolding and how they are unfolding. I mean, nobody's sure what they're unfolding. We've seen multiple arrows on the map, one from the north, one from the east, one from the south. We've seen Crimea, which has been held. As far as, figures go, the simple thing is the AFVs were 3,000 plus for Ukraine, 15,000 plus for Russia. I mean, there's wide disparity. They have 900 helicopters versus 55. There are 132 aircraft versus 139. So there's, a great disparity between the two armies. Ukraine historically has been one area like northern India where multiple invaders have been through. The Napoleon army in the Russian Napoleon-French war marched through that. You saw Operation Barbarossa, where the German panzers actually marched westward through that. So, I mean, the people are resilient. They know that these issues are occurring. But what is more important is how they plan to do it. Naturally, like you very correctly brought out, it was a multi-pronged invasion. They wanted precision strikes. They wanted simultaneity. They had air defense. They had electronic warfare. They had cyber. They had the Spetsnaz troop. So they tried to use everything. Now, where have they reached exactly? What aims have they got? I mean, this is open to speculation, but the minute armor and other things start fighting a battle which is part conventional, part unconventional, little bit in the gray zone, and get bogged down in cities, you lead to, casualties which are from different sources. You can have, people engaging you from closer ranges, hitting you at vulnerable spots. There is no clash of the army so far, but what we are seeing is a clash between the defense forces of one side and, a sort of people's revolt which is coming up. Another school of thought, I mean, it's something which some people are talking about, and it may not be true, is that the US, is allowed Russia to get in here, and they feel that they'll get bogged down like the US got bogged down in Afghanistan. That's another school of thought. And they feel that, it's irrespective of whether, they have adequate foreign reserves, whether the price of oil will go up. And if the price of oil does go up, like General Kamath said, it will benefit Russia. But who will buy that oil from Russia if there's sanctions? It's only China. So Russia and China will get closer to each other. And in this case, Russia will be dependent on Chinese money coming in to support Russia. So this is another issue that, whether it can take place or not, it can be speculated about and can be talked about as to, in the earlier days during the Cold War I, if this is being called Cold War II, US actually wanted to divide China and Russia. And what is it doing in Cold War II? Is it getting these two people closer together?
Very close to each other, yes.
Can US have the ability and capability to take on both US and China simultaneously? And now the issue of, like Sir very rightly brought out, the Indian stance. Now, Indian stance has been, in a particular direction, a very balanced approach to this whole thing. But one of our major problems, immediate problems, apart from the other things, like we are dependent on Russia for defense and all, but the major issue we have now is we have large number of students. So now we have large number of students there. And if those students can't get out of there, then the government is being shown in a weak light. We just had an incident where one student has been killed. Now, whether he's been killed by Russians or whether he's been killed by Ukrainians or whether he's just come in the crossfire, whether it was collateral damage, but all these raises issues and will force the government to act. Till what time can we keep a neutral stance is again a question, that I mean, it's open to all of you to discuss. I mean, this is what I feel. And, things are not going to be easy. The world, I feel, has changed drastically, and we have to start living with new realities. And as General Kamath very rightly said, and that is the bottom line, which you must understand, that ultimately it is military capability and the ability to use the force, willingness to use the force. In our northern borders, we fight alone, sir, irrespective of any pact, anything. Absolutely, we will fight alone, and we have to build up our military capability. And the last point I'd like to say is that, the world always felt, there was a myth of nuclear deterrence, that you're taking on NATO, you're taking on US, you have nuclear weapons. 1994, unfortunately, Ukraine had to dismantle their nuclear weapons after the Budapest Accord. So they've taken on this, but has this myth of nuclear weapons been disillusioned to an extent? What is the deterrent value of nuclear weapons? So you're back to fighting with conventional weapons on ground today. Your focus is back on conventional weapons, armor, artillery, infantry, long-range vectors, electronic warfare, aircraft, ships. I mean, that's the thing now. So where are we standing today? I'd request General Kamath, to speak on this issue, please.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Jagatbir, for bringing this aspect out. And it really is a very stark reminder. And also, it's a pity that Mr. Putin has to reach a stage where he starts making the nuclear noise. That's now the gentleman going to very shortage of time. I request you for very brief closing comments. Jayadev.
Anil, very interesting discussion so far, but as you said, let me just throw out 2-3 points, some of which dare to look at the situation slightly differently. Firstly, I think strategic realities we have to look at. What the Americans have done, to my mind, which General Jagatbir hinted at as a possible scenario, I think it's a scenario that's developing and it's becoming very real. Ukraine has basically been asked to fight its own battle. They are arming it, but that's about it.
That's it. Yes.
In Europe have started encouraging their citizens to go on as a volunteer force and fight in Ukraine. So what we are seeing is Ukraine actually becoming Europe's Afghanistan. That's how I'd put it. That leaves the Americans pretty happy because they're getting the Europeans to sort that theater out, and they will focus on China. That China is their biggest threat. Number of their presidents have said it, including Biden, who's followed that policy, and he will focus on it. And that's got the Chinese really worried. So they are looking at that aspect. If the Americans don't follow through on that, then I'm afraid we are looking at a really changed scenario with the Americans literally being rolled back. That's one. And all of us are having to face a very unpleasant prospect of a China-Russia combination in the world. The second is when we are talking sanctions, I think the Americans have started targeting the SWIFT, etc. It's going to hit Russia because they have also targeted the central bank by hampering its ability to put out money. It will bring Russia down to essentially barter trade. They'll be giving gold in return for certain other objects. The only thing is the oil and gas, and China is the consumer. So with China, they're fine. With the rest of the world, there'll be a problem. Ukraine's natural resources we haven't touched on. They've got neon, palladium, etc. Very essential items without which you really cannot function. They're like rare earths and minerals. They're required for everything. And Ukraine, as you know, jet engine spares, tank engine spares, etc. It's Ukraine, which is
yes, that we know from having dealt with them. Oh, with 75% of our dependency on the USSR for Army, Navy, and Air Force, we know only too well.
So the Chinese are also going to get hit by it. And then finally, if I may just conclude by saying that the Chinese have been apprehending, and I think they're quite right, and I think General Kamath probably alluded to it, global shortage of grains by 2030-35. Russia is one of the biggest producers of grain, so Chinese will probably get into some kind of deal with them. But Ukraine supplies them on nearly 70% of grain. That's gone. Soybeans out of the picture, oil out of the picture, rapeseed oil. The other countries are not going to come to US. So I think looking at it from another scenario, it's going to be a tough, long drawn out battle. The only question that I have is, how come the Russian army, which is supposed to be so tough and big, how come they really haven't made a, gained ground really? I was thinking that sort of slice through to Odessa and to Kiev, etc. That hasn't happened.
No, you're right. You're very right. That has not happened. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jayadev. Kamath, very briefly, please, only because of shortage of time.
Okay. Thank you. I will try to answer what General Jagat and Jayadev has said. Why has even it amuses me why it has not gone? Actually, Russia can raise Kyiv to the ground in no uncertain terms. In next 1 or 2 days, it will be not there. Russia is deliberately not doing it and raising it to the ground due to the collateral damages and the civilians who will be killed. And as rightly said by General Jagat, not one Ukraine formation has really clashed with the Russian formations. And if you give arms, weapons, equipment, and anti-tank missiles and all to the civilians, and the civilians are contesting the Russians from the residential area, any field commander will destroy that residential area. Let there be no doubts. There is nothing called as residential areas. If the fire is coming from that area, it is simple as that. So the cost of the civilian casualty will multiply in this. To lay a siege to Kiev and then do a fighting in built-up areas and clear one building after the other will take another 1 year or so, 6 months. It's not going to happen. So they have to see which is the center of gravity, probably the presidential palace or the headquarters or something, and then seize it. The radio stations they have to seize, TV towers they have to seize, communication centers they have to seize, and they cannot really go inch by inch and building by building in such a highly built up area. They will never be successful. I am sure the Russians have a strategy. If they want to race to the ground with the mother of all bombs and other bombs which they have, it is no point. They will come under international retribution much more if they start destroying. Now, next is we have to understand that no country will come to an aid of another country unless they are treaty bound. NATO is treaty bound. That Article 5 says a threat to one is threat to all the other 30. There is no such a treaty, and US doesn't want to jump into all hot spots after their sad experience, because they did not have an exit strategy in Afghanistan. They did not really have an exit strategy in Vietnam. They did created. But, and also, Putin's perception management of Russian has been very, very poor. They have not been able to highlight the atrocities committed by the US and NATO forces in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Libya, Grenada, Vietnam, where 2 million civilians were killed. Nothing is there. Now you are painting Putin like Hitler and then trying to parade him around on your social media. So it is. The entire geopolitical situation will change. And if Russia, I will tell you one more point which I think General Jagatbir brought. February, March was the Crimean invasion and annexation, 2014. In May, Russia had a deal of $400 billion of natural gas coming from Russia to China for next 30 years. This entire thing, the sanctions, whatever were imposed, were overcome in the next 3 months. You see the pattern. So sanction and all may not work, that the suspension from the Judo Federation, honorary president, you are not allowed to take part in European singing competition by the Russian team, that Slovakia will not play football with so-and-so. Russia, rugby, what you call, international rugby has thrown out Russia. These are all minor points over the geostrategic aims which Russia is finding. I got a lot to say, but due to shortage of time, thank you.
And I must thank you very much, General Kamath. I'm afraid I must stop you here only because of a paucity of time. And Jagatbir, I'm sure there's more that you would have added, but again, it's please do pardon us for that. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for bringing out some very important and relevant points in a battle which is ongoing, and I'm sure we'll have much more to see and say.